Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So this series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, February 18th, 1984, hearings are set to begin at the New York State Liquor Authority about the nightclub Chippendales. Chippendales, if you know the name, it was, of course, the male exotic dancing franchise that took off in the late 70s and early 80s. At this point, it was successful enough that it had a club in New York City, the Chippendales Club, at 1st Avenue and 61st Street. Now, this hearing was ostensibly about a liquor license, but it was really, as you will see, about this new phenomenon of male strippers and all the puritanical freakouts and sexual mores that come with that. And this episode of this podcast that you're listening to right now is ostensibly about political history, but it's actually going to be about this very cool thing that our very own Nicole Hemmer is involved in. So first I will say hello, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hi there.
Hello, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson is here with us as well of Wellesley. Hello, Kellie.
Hey there.
And yes, Niki, this is your show here, figuratively and literally, because we're hooking this to the release of this really great podcast series called Welcome to Your Fantasy that is out now on Spotify. You've been working on it for a long time, and it's a multi-part series about the history of Chippendale. So first off, congratulations. Everyone should go listen.
Thank you. Yes, it's been a 2-year journey with male strippers, which is not the worst companion on this journey of life. But it is nice to finally share them with the world.
The series, we should say, is hosted by Natalia Petrozella, who's also your co-host on another podcast, Past Present, so it all ties together. So, I want to talk about the whole series and Chippendales, and especially sort of how we can view it as a political story. But let's start with this liquor board hearing, because I think it does provide an entry point into all these bigger ideas. So what's going on with New York trying to crack down on the Chippendales Club?
So we should say that the Chippendales clubs were constantly running into trouble with liquor boards and with fire marshals because they tended to pack their clubs to the brims, which is against the fire code. But in this case, the particular problem was that it was a club that was discriminating against men. It had a women's only policy, particularly when the men were dancing. They would often allow men to come in after the strippers because now you had a bunch of women who were having just enjoyed seeing men take their clothes off, and it seemed to be the right time to let the guys into the club. But by and large, it was just this idea that Americans were starting to have to contend with during second wave feminism, which was, what does equal rights look like? And if you can close down a club because it doesn't allow women, can you close down a club because it doesn't allow men? And
generally, how would those kinds of decisions shake out?
Yeah, it was kind of a mixed bag. So part of it was that Chippendales would argue, A, that it was an exclusive club, or that it was a private club. This was the same thing that they used to explain why they didn't allow black patrons in. We can circle back on that. But also that men were allowed in the club, but only at certain hours. So they were like, you need to have these women-only spaces, but we're not exclusive. It's not that we never let men in. But ultimately, this is a thing that keeps coming up again and again. In fact, Gloria Allred will sue the club in 1988 for not allowing men into Chippendales.
Let's put that aside for a second, because I think this whole, as you were saying, this whole question of sexual norms and reverse sexism and all these other things is super fascinating. But, to paint a picture of Chippendales itself, which is what the first couple episodes of the podcast do a wonderful job of doing as well. By the time we're talking here in 1984, I mean, what kind of phenomenon is Chippendales?
It's huge. So it starts off in 1979 as this seedy little club in LA. And the guy who started it, his name's Steve Banerjee. He's an immigrant from India. He is trying to find something that will make his club famous and will make him a lot of money. And so he tries all kinds of things like backgammon, ladies mud wrestling. None of these things really work. But the idea of men taking off their clothes for women really does, because it hits that kind of both counterintuitive thing and the caricature of feminism that people have in their minds by 1979. They are explicitly promoting this as turning the tables on men so that the ladies of the 80s who are newly liberated can come into Chippendales and enjoy a reversal of roles.
I think this is so fascinating. And I can understand why there's going to be a lot of, buzz about the podcast, because I think about this moment and I'm wondering two things. If I can ask about like the backlash, is there sort of a racial backlash? Like, are Black women either wanting to participate in this, or are there Black Chippendales? Like, how do they get around that? And then also, I want to talk about sort of like the reverse sexism, like this idea that like men can sort of find employment anywhere, but women can't. And when women do this work, it's precarious and dangerous even. But for men, it's almost like a joke.
Yeah, I mean, to kind of flip these things around, the male strippers at Chippendales are having sex like 3 to 4 times a night. They're enjoying this as a perk of the job. And it's hard to imagine a woman stripper just seeing sex with the men at the club as a perk of the job. It's not typically the way that works. And it gives you a sense of some of the unevenness in positions. But on the question of racism, so we go into this in episode 4 because there is a discrimination lawsuit. But Steve Banerjee is worried that the club will become, as he puts it, too Black. And so they don't want Black patrons, or they don't want more than a sprinkling. They want just enough Black patrons to make it look like they're not discriminating, but not so many that it gets a reputation as a Black club. And they only allow one Black male stripper at any one time. So again, they want one, both because of charges of discrimination and because they think some of the patrons want to see a Black man. But they have a pretty hard line against having any more, again, because they see Black strippers as down market and Black patrons as down market. And they're very clear about that.
Wow. It's also fascinating to me, too, because when you think about like the stereotypes of how Black men get sexualized, you could see Black strippers also being, seen as maybe competitive, right, in the way that women would respond to them, or in the way that, their sexuality is being gawked at in this particular space. It allows for a lot of, fantasies and voyeurism and all of that when you think about what's going on.
Oh, yeah. I mean, so we include a dancer whose name is Hidari Sababu, and he was the main Black dancer there. And he not only talked about how, he was one of the most popular dancers there, but how it actually foreclosed on opportunities for him as the franchise was becoming more popular. For instance, he couldn't be in the calendar because they couldn't sell the calendar in the South if it had a Black man in it. There's this time when they go on Facts of Life as kind of a cameo, and he's the only dancer that's not allowed to kiss one of the main characters. So that racism is absolutely shaping all of his experiences there.
Wow. That's wild.
When we think about the conversations that broke out around the Chippendales phenomenon, were they mostly centered on the men who were dancing, the experience of the men who were dancing, or on the women who were attending?
That's a great question. I mean, a lot of it was focused on the men who were dancing because of this idea that they were doing something that was lewd and improper. Remember, this is the height of the religious right. There's a lot of angst around the sexualization of the culture. But there's also this idea that women are giving in to lust and therefore putting their own souls at risk. This is kind of the Christian right argument against this, is that you're not only indulging these men, but you're harming these women and their marriages. There was a lot of concern about these women's marriages and how they might be harmed by going to Chippendales. So the conversation about sex at Chippendales looks both ways. I mean, the actual story is far more sordid, right? It's not just that women are watching these men, but they're having sex with these men. They're paying for sex with these men. It is kind of a space of both sex and sex work. But even the more purified public image is seen as somehow a threat.
Yeah. And I have to imagine that this also has to push back on this notion that women aren't visual, that men are visual. Men care. Men want to look at women all the time. But women don't care about those things, you know? And that really blows up that whole myth or debunks it like, what? You know, as a way of showing how women can be tantalized by naked bodies and bare chests and all of that.
That is absolutely the case. I will say that there's also a real focus on making sure there's a story, because women want stories, and that's like the key to unlocking their sexual desire. And so many of these Chippendale dances aren't just guys like coming out and taking their clothes off. It's like them acting out a little skit about why they're taking their clothes off, which makes it a little different than many.
Because they need to have a connection first, right? I need to know
exactly.
You first.
Hey, you know, men like stories too. Everyone likes stories. I just want to say, you know,
I like a nice, good narrative.
Yeah, a nice 3-act structure. There's nothing wrong with that. Hero's journey, you know.
Yeah. Oh man.
So next episode, actually, we're doing an episode about Betty Friedan and the feminine mystique and the publishment, and you know, in that episode we're going to look at the rise of second wave feminism, and that book was published, you know, a generation earlier than what we're talking about here, but you know, a reevaluation of the domestic life of women, and I'm curious, Niki, how the Chippendale story fits into feminism, you know, what the wave of feminism that we're in by the time we're in the early 80s. And it strikes me as like that's first and second wave feminism conversation was about sort of two spheres, you know, the domestic sphere and the work sphere. And this is some different sphere that needs to be grappled with.
Yeah, so I think that it's a point of bridge feminism in a way. So if the 1970s second wave feminism was about the personal as political, women's sexual desire, their sex lives were part of that conversation. And then by the 1990s, the sexual politics of women become more central to feminism, particularly conversations about rape and domestic violence, about date rape, those kinds of things get brought to the surface a lot more. But at the same time, I don't want to lay the feminism label too heavily on Chippendales, right? A lot of the story of Chippendales is the co-optation or the commercialism of feminism, right? Is something that can be empowerment is something that can be sold to women, and that I think is still very much alive in our culture, right? From like Dove body wash to whatever. Like women are constantly being sold empowerment and being told, you know, shell out $25 and we're going to liberate you, which I think is distinctly different from what many second wave feminists were pushing in their vision of feminism.
Yeah, I know. I just think it's absurd, the idea that you can sell empowerment. It's everything is packaged, everything's a commodity, but you know, you like to think empowerment comes like from within, you know what I mean? But no, it's like everything is being sold as fantasy or some form of, you know, tangible commodity.
Well, it comes down to capitalism at the end, guys.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I agree. That is incredibly depressing. I will also say that there's some element here, though, too, of also like reinforcing this basic, like, if something seems fishy and off, like, trust that. And it's like this guy at the heart of this, Banerjee, like he's clearly like a schemer. So when he's walking around talking about women's empowerment, like it should be pretty easy for people's spidey sense to go off and be like, I don't really think this guy's a feminist. Like, you know, I think there's an angle
here.
And
why do you want this? What are your motivations?
Yeah, exactly. So I think there's like a little bit of just trust your gut, so to speak, with some of these people.
Yeah, not to spoil the story, but I will mention that this is a true crime story and that Banerjee may not be the most trustworthy figure in this tale.
I love it. I love it.
All right. Well, that's a great tease to end on. And we will say that Welcome to Your Fantasies out now on Spotify. If you have a Spotify account, you can go and listen to it there. And then it will soon be out on all podcast apps and people should check it out. But again, Niki, congratulations. It must feel good to just have it out in the world.
Thank you. And thank you for letting us chat a little bit about it today. It's one of my favorite things to talk about right now.
One of a lot of people's favorite things to talk about.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you as always.
Thanks for having me.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. You can follow us on social media at ThisDayPod, Twitter and Instagram. Our website is thisdaypod.com. You can read about us there. You can get in touch with questions or comments about the show or suggestions for topics. We always appreciate those. My name is Jody Avergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.